Welcome to the WWC Advanced Group Design Standards, or RDD, training module focused on continuity of the relationship between the outcome and the forcing variable in regression discontinuity design studies. You can access all the resources mentioned in this module through the WWC website, whatworks.ed.gov. This module describes the WWC's third regression discontinuity design standard, often called the continuity standard, which outlines requirements for RDDs to establish continuity of the relationship between the outcome and the forcing variable used in the design. This module introduces the concept of continuity in the relationship between the outcome and the forcing variable, and then describes how the WWC assesses such continuity in RDD studies. After completing this module, you will be able to define what is meant by continuity in the relationship between the outcome and forcing variable in an RDD and why the WWC is concerned about that continuity. You will be able to describe the WWC's continuity standard and will know how to apply that standard when conducting a WWC review of an RDD study. The WWC's continuity standard focuses on the concept of continuity or smoothness in the relationship between the outcome and forcing variable at the cutoff used in an RDD. The WWC's focus on continuity is due to the concern that something other than the intervention could be responsible for the intervention impact observed at the cutoff. To obtain a consistent impact estimate at the cutoff using an RDD, there must be evidence that in the absence of the intervention, there will be a smooth relationship between the outcome and forcing variable at the cutoff. This smoothness condition is required to ensure that any observed discontinuity in the outcomes of the intervention and comparison group units at the cutoff can be attributed to the intervention. This smoothness condition cannot be assessed directly. The WWC instead uses indirect approaches to assess for continuity. As shown in this table from the handbook, to completely satisfy the continuity standard, the regression discontinuity design must satisfy two criteria. There must be no graphical evidence of extra discontinuities in the outcome forcing variable relationship, and no statistical evidence of extra discontinuities in the outcome forcing variable relationship. To partially satisfy the continuity standard, an RDD study must meet at least one of these two criteria. If an RDD study does not satisfy at least one of these criteria, the study findings will not satisfy the continuity standard. We will now describe each of these three criteria in greater detail. Criterion A of the continuity standard, which we will hereafter refer to as RDD Criterion 3A, requires that there be no evidence when using graphical analyses of a discontinuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship at values of the forcing variable other than the cutoff value, unless a satisfactory explanation of such a discontinuity is provided. The graphical analysis to support RDD Criterion 3A would typically entail a scatter plot of the outcome and forcing variable, using either the raw data or data averaged or aggregated within bins or intervals. To satisfy RDD Criterion 3A, this graphical analysis must not show a discontinuity at any forcing variable value within the bandwidth that is larger than 2 times the standard error of the impact estimated at the cutoff, unless a satisfactory explanation of that discontinuity is provided. When the authors are estimating impacts within a bandwidth, the goal is to look for egregious changes in the slope that may indicate some event other than the intervention that may be changing the relationship between the outcome and the forcing variable. If a bandwidth is not used for the analysis, then this graphical analysis must not show a discontinuity at any forcing variable unless a satisfactory explanation of that discontinuity is reported. An example of a satisfactory explanation for an observed discontinuity might be when that discontinuity corresponds to some other known intervention that was also administered using the same forcing variable but a different cutoff value. If you are uncertain about any graphical display, you should raise your questions with review team leadership. Here is an example graph from a hypothetical RDD that displays the association between the forcing variable on the x-axis and the outcome variable on the y-axis. In this example, the cutoff score of 50 on the forcing variable is used to assign participants to conditions, with those scoring at or below the cutoff being assigned to the intervention group and those scoring above the cutoff being assigned to the comparison group. The scatter plot provides graphical evidence to support RDD criterion 3A. There is no evidence in this graph of a discontinuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship at values of the forcing variable other than the cutoff value. In this example, there is a clear discontinuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship at the cutoff value of 50. However, there are no other discontinuities observed at any other values of the forcing variable. Conversely, this scatter plot would not provide graphical evidence to support RDD criterion 3A because there is graphical evidence of a discontinuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship at values of the forcing variable other than the cutoff value. Although we still observe a discontinuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship at the cutoff value of 50, there is now also a clear discontinuity observed at the value of 55 on the forcing variable. In this example, if that discontinuity observed at the value of 55 of the forcing variable was larger than 2 times the standard error of the intervention impact estimated at the cutoff, and if the authors do not provide a satisfactory explanation of this discontinuity, then such a study would not satisfy RDD criterion 3A. The second criterion of the continuity standard, which we refer to here as RDD criterion 3B, requires that there be no evidence using statistical tests of the discontinuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship at values of the forcing variable other than the cutoff value, unless a satisfactory explanation of such a discontinuity is provided. The statistical test used to address RDD criterion 3B must use the same algorithm for selecting the bandwidth and or the functional form as was used to estimate the impact on the outcome. So, for RDDs that use a bandwidth, the bandwidths at the other values of the outcome forcing variable relationships may be different than the bandwidth at the cutoff. Similarly, for RDDs that use a fit statistic to select the best functional form, the functional form selected for other values of the outcome forcing variable relationship may be different than what was selected for the cutoff, as long as the authors use the same fit statistic for the other cutoffs. Further, these statistical tests must be conducted for at least 4 values of the forcing variable below the cutoff and 4 values above the cutoff, and at least 95% of the estimated impacts on the outcome at other values of the forcing variable must not be statistically significant at the 5% significance level. This requirement accounts for the expectation that some estimates may be statistically significant due to type 1 error. If these impacts are estimated for fewer than 20 values of the forcing variable, then all of them must not be statistically significant at the 5% significance level. Time for your first knowledge check in this module. On the next slide, we will present a graph drawn from a hypothetical study and describe some features of the graph. As you consider this graph, your question is, Does this study satisfy RDD Criterion 3? Your choices are A. Yes, B. No. In this graph, the dark shaded region that surrounds the best fit curve represents the 95% confidence interval for the best fit curve. The lighter gray shaded region between the dotted lines represents the bandwidth. The solid vertical line represents the cutoff score on the forcing variable. And the distance between the dashed horizontal lines equals 2 times the standard error of the intervention impact estimate. So again, based on this graph, does this study satisfy RDD Criterion 3A for graphical continuity and the outcome forcing variable relationship? Your choices are A. Yes, or B. No. You may want to pause the video now to think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Based on the graph provided, RDD Criterion 3A is satisfied because the scatter plot of the outcome and the forcing variable does not show a discontinuity at any forcing variable value within the bandwidth that is larger than 2 times the standard error of the impact estimated at the cutoff. Thus, this study provides graphical evidence of continuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship. Knowledge check 2. A regression discontinuity study reported an impact of the outcome of 0.10 based on a quadratic regression selected using the Bayesian Information Criterion BIC goodness of fit measure. The authors conducted sensitivity analyses by calculating discontinuities and the outcome at 26 values of the forcing variable other than the actual cutoff, all based on linear, quadratic, or cubic regression selected using the BIC criterion. Half of the values were above and half were below the actual cutoff. The values were evenly spaced across the distribution of the forcing variable. One of those discontinuities was statistically significant at the 5% level. Does this study satisfy the RDD Criterion 3B for statistical continuity in the outcome forcing variable relationships? Your choices are A. Yes, or B. No. You may want to pause this video now to think about your answer. The correct answer is A. Based on the information provided, RDD Criterion 3B is satisfied because the statistical tests used to assess continuity use the same BIC algorithm for selecting the functional form as was used to estimate the impact on the outcome, and these statistical tests were conducted for at least 4 values of the forcing variable below the cutoff and 4 values above the cutoff, and finally, because at least 95% or 25 out of the 26 of those impacts were not statistically significant. Thus, this study would satisfy RDD Criterion 3B. Knowledge Check 3. An RDD study examined the impact of a bilingual education program on English learners' language proficiency outcomes. The study satisfies RDD Criterion 3A, graphical evidence of continuity. However, the authors did not report any statistical evidence regarding continuity in the outcome forcing variable relationship. For the continuity standard, or the RDD standard 3, does this study A. completely satisfy the standard, B. partially satisfy the standard, or C. does not satisfy the standard? You may want to pause the video now to think about your answer. The correct answer is B. To partially satisfy the continuity standard, the study must satisfy either criterion A or criterion B. Because the study satisfies 3A but not 3B, the study partially satisfies the continuity standard. Recall that RDDs can use individual or cluster level assignment of units to considerations. When reviewers assess RDD Standard 3 for cluster assignment RDDs, there are no unique considerations required for these cluster level assignment designs. Namely, reviewers will assess study findings against RDD Standard 3 using individual level or cluster level data, depending on what type of data the researchers analyzed. Recall that some RDDs may report pooled impacts for some combination of forcing variables, cutoffs, and samples. Remember that pooled impacts are defined as those based on data from each combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample that are standardized and grouped into a single dataset for which a single impact is calculated. When reviewers assess RDD Standard 3 for RDDs reporting pooled impacts, there are no additional considerations needed. However, when RDDs report aggregate impacts, there are a few additional considerations needed when reviewers are assessing RDD Standard 3. Remember that aggregate impacts are defined as those that are calculated as weighted averages of impacts calculated separately for every combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample. When assessing RDD Criterion 3A for aggregate impact findings, the requirements for this criterion must be applied cumulatively across all combinations of forcing variables, cutoffs, and samples. Namely, there must not be evidence of an unexplained discontinuity at any non-cutoff value within the bandwidth of any forcing variable for any sample. This means that a graphical analysis must be presented for every combination of forcing variable, cutoff, and sample. In cases where impacts from disjointed samples, meaning non-overlapping samples, are aggregated, it is acceptable to exclude from the aggregate impact any impacts from samples that do not satisfy this criterion because such exclusions would be considered exogenous. And when assessing RDD Criterion 3B for aggregate impact findings, the requirements for this criterion must again be applied cumulatively across all combinations of forcing variables, cutoffs, and samples. Namely, at least 95% of estimated impacts at values of the forcing variable other than the cutoffs across all samples must be statistically insignificant. In cases where impacts from disjointed or non-overlapping samples are being aggregated, it is again acceptable to exclude from the aggregate impact any impacts from samples that do not satisfy this criterion, because again, such exclusions would be considered exogenous. This concludes our module on the WWC's RDD Continuity Standard, or RDD Standard 3. Let's review what we discussed in this module. We described the two criteria used to assess the continuity standard. To completely satisfy the continuity standard, an RDD study finding must satisfy both criteria A and B, which require establishing graphical evidence of continuity and statistical evidence of continuity of the outcome forcing variable relationship. To partially satisfy the continuity standard, an RDD study finding must satisfy either criterion A or criterion B. Otherwise, an RDD study finding would not satisfy the continuity standard or RDD Standard 3. Recall that there are 5 total standards that determine a study finding's research rating. You are now familiar with 3 of the 5 standards. For a study finding to receive a rating of meets WWC standards without reservations, a study must completely satisfy the continuity standard. For a study finding to receive a rating of meets WWC standards with reservations, it partially must satisfy the continuity standard. A study finding that fails to satisfy this standard, at least partially, will receive a rating of does not meet WWC standards. The next module in the training series will focus on the 4th RDD standard, which outlines requirements for appropriate functional form and bandwidth specification in RDD studies.